I should just go. Hello, everybody. I know this is the last talk of the event, so I'm going to try and keep it quick and make room for questions as well, because questions are always the fun bit. If you don't know who I am, this is me, Sam Barlow. If you do know who I am, it's probably because of these 3 FMV games that I made, starting with Her Story in 2015, then Telling Lies, and most recently, Immortality. However, I have been making games for over 25 years. I basically started in 1999. I released this little text game, Isle, which was a free text game, and it became something of a kind of cult game. But then after that, I worked in mainstream games for a lot of publishers and got the chance to work on Silent Hill. I made 2 Silent Hill games, and this one, Silent Hill Shattered Memories, is the one I'm proud of. It's a really cool game. I will talk about it a little bit in this talk. But yeah, that's me. So let's see what we're going to talk about. I really wanted to tell you about the games we're working on, but it's a little bit too early to spoil those. So this was the closest I could get to talking about those games and what motivates them. I've included, I tried really hard to include Spanish artists throughout this presentation so that you can understand I have a real affinity for this country and its culture. Actually, this is a terrible example of how broken the internet is now. I was trying to find a good quality picture of this Dali painting, and the version on Wikipedia was like 200 pixels and was really shitty. But this was on a Chinese website for a company that uses bots to just generate paintings for your living room. And so this is what it would look like if you bought one of their prints to put in your beautiful apartment. I'm sure that Salvador Dali would have been pleased with that. I don't know if you know, towards the end of his life, Salvador Dali realized that the most valuable thing about his paintings was his signature. And he sold a suitcase full of blank paper, which he had signed to some criminals for a lot of money. So I think he would, he would embrace the dystopia that we live in. So I'm going to be talking about dreams. The title of this talk is We Live Inside a Dream. I think dreams are very special and important, and I want games to be more like dreams. So I'm going to explain why. But to start with, I want to dedicate this talk to a wonderful person we lost recently, David Lynch, who, as the foremost American surrealist, for me, defined a lot of what it means to create art that is dreamlike. So let's hear a little bit from David. Oh, is he going to talk? No. Damn it, technology. I will fill in for you. So in this scene, David Lynch is directing an actress, and he leans down to her and he says, "Let's get dreamy." And the only direction he gives her is, "You're kind of like a doll in a dream." But if you ever watch behind the scenes with David Lynch, 90% of his direction to actors is just get dreamy. And I think that is advice that I try and take to heart. So why do I want to talk about dreams? Why do I think dreams are important? I'm going to get very pretentious and primal now. I believe that as human beings, we exist simultaneously in 2 worlds. There is the world of the mind and the imagination, and then on the right-hand side, there is reality, the material reality we live in. And commonly, we think about the real world, material reality, as being the most important thing, as the place that is truthful and is real. But even that reality is experienced through our mind. And I think actually the world of our mind, the experience we have as humans subjectively viewing the world, is actually the primary place in which we're living our lives and is of the utmost importance. And dreams, for me, are this wonderful moment where we get to see what our mind can do when it is not tethered or attached to material reality. right? When we have dreams, we see ourselves processing our lives, and we're thinking about events, time, space, mushing it all together, and we're a lot freer. And I think that's kind of a beautiful moment. And I think it's no mistake that the most successful art mediums we have often talk in the language of dreams. If we think about cinema in particular, the way that footage is edited together in films is dreamlike, right? This is something that Lynch plugged into. When you see an image and then we cut to a different image, there is a magical connection that happens. There is some meaning that does not exist in those two images, that doesn't exist in the material reality that is exposed. So I think thinking about dreams, thinking about dreamlike experiences is very powerful and important. I'm going to take a little brief diversion into politics. So a huge influence on me were the Surrealists, some of these guys over here. We got Louis Buñuel here, who I also brought with me to represent. When we think of the Surrealists now, we kind of think of them as artists who made weird things. But actually, for the Surrealists, art was kind of, it was not the end. Art was a means to the end. And actually, a lot of their motivation was political. The Surrealists felt that rational thinking and rationalism is what had driven humanity into a dark place at the start of the 20th century. So all of the bad isms, right, colonialism, industrialization, fascism, they attributed to too much rational thought. They believed that rational thought unchecked took us to these dark places. And obviously right now, we're living through a time when things are getting kind of dark again. So for the Surrealists, the idea of tapping into the irrational at the heart of being human was of primary importance. And they wanted to find ways to free the conscious mind to think more irrationally. One thing that they did do is they used games. There's a lot of games they would use, especially games of chance, that they would use as a way of allowing Surrealists to not think consciously and escape some of those trappings of rational thought and explore ideas that were more dreamlike. In fact, André Breton, who was a bit of an asshole, he said the most surrealist act that you could commit would be to run out into the street and shoot a random person dead. The Surrealists were young men and they were edgelords. So, you know, and whenever I played Grand Theft Auto, I think about the Surrealists because Grand Theft Auto thinks of itself as being the Godfather or the Sopranos, right? It thinks it's telling this very special story, but mostly what people enjoy about those games is the chaotic moment of being able to run around the streets and shoot people and live out these kind of unhinged fantasies. And so there's a little bit, when I play those games, where I connect those back to the Surrealists. So that is my segue back into games. Even before I knew who the Surrealists were as a child, I realized there was something special about games and the way it played with my mind. I noted that if I played a game, I would have incredible memory of the game. I could watch a movie or I could read a book, and I would sort of forget a lot of the details. It would sort of disappear from my brain. Whereas every game that I played, I would have this really perfect memory of it. There was something about the fact that games are this kind of version of lived experience, that it's something we actually live through that plays with your mind. I noted as well that they changed how I dreamed. When I first played the original Tomb Raider, played a lot of that game, and I realized I'd started to dream in third person. And my dreams were kind of pixelated and low poly. And you know, there are scientists who believe that if you look at early man, when we started drawing on caves, right, the very first art, the very first language that we created, it was only after that that we started to actually think and have an inner monologue. And there is this idea that art and language are actually tools which allow us to think, allow us to process our experience, and can change the way we think. So I think there's something very profound and special about how games play with your mind. I remember playing Metroid Prime on the GameCube, And the way that that game made me think about three-dimensionality, the way its levels were laid out, changed how I thought about my reality. I remember walking down the street through a neighborhood that I had walked through hundreds of times, and now I'm looking around and I'm thinking, I could jump over there, I could climb up to the top of this building, right? It genuinely changed how I experienced and viewed the reality around me. So I think there's something very special about games, right? If you think about what a dream is, you think about what a game is, they're very similar, right? When you play a game, you are living through this experience that doesn't exist. It's in your mind largely, and we deal with a lot of abstractions. So a game is very similar to a dream. And for me, thinking of games as a waking dream is a really useful tool that will enable us to then get to that dreamlike state, which I think is so special. However, I think largely in games, when we talk about dreamlike structures or ideas or talk about things being surreal, it's usually this very surface level thing. So this here is this is a game called Weird Dreams back on the Amiga. It looks very weird and crazy, but the actual game is pretty straightforward. It is not a dreamlike game. And I believe that if we acknowledge that games are a waking dream, we can then engineer the games to make them more magical. Okay, but right now, there are a lot of things about most games that are not dreamlike, right? Games are obsessed with systems. Games are obsessed with the rules and the laws of physics. In most games, time and space are continuous. We live in these environments that end up being very prosaic, down to earth. Nothing feels truly dreamlike. So I think we can think about ways that we can actually change the experience of existing in a game, make them more dreamlike, and that will be really special. And I think of, when I think of Buñuel, and I think of his movies, when Buñuel shoots a dream, similar to David Lynch, they don't make it look like a dream, right? The characters in a Buñuel movie are not walking around going, this is weird, I'm in a dream, woo, right? They treat it as reality. And I think there's something about how Lynch and Buñuel take seriously the logic of dreams, the language of dreams. And it reminds me, there was an actor I worked with who was explaining to me how to act drunk. And he said, the key to acting drunk is to absolutely try to not appear drunk. He said, if you concentrate on speaking as clearly as possible, on not appearing drunk, that will actually have the effect of making you look drunk. And I think there is something about how seriously Lynch and Buñuel treat being in a dreamlike state. They don't treat it like a dream, right? They treat it as reality, and I think that is transformative. This is a game I love to make people play and reference. This is a game called 30 Flights of Loving. This is a game that it quite happily will cut through time and space, and as you play the game, you're just popping in and out of different time frames, different locations, and the experience of playing this game is magical. It feels like you're living through a dream, and it's the kind of transformative energy that I look for in games that I play. So how do I personally go about making games more dreamlike? How do I think we can usefully take lessons from dreams and the language of dreams? Here are two things that I kind of talk about and focus on within the team. The first is randomness, and then we'll get to expression. So randomness is very broadly used within video games, right? You'll think of it most commonly used in an RPG or a strategy game to essentially juice the strategy or the stats, right? Across a total playtime, I know that I have a 75% chance with this weapon. It's kind of noodling in stats, so it's not very magical kind of randomness. Something like Diablo uses randomness for its loot drops. Again, it's largely this sort of meta game balance thing, but occasionally, like the idea of a piece of loot that has a very low chance of appearing and could randomly appear for me does feel a little bit magical. But for me, I'm really interested in the idea of applying randomness to parts of the game that people would normally consider that's a terrible idea. You're forbidden, right? So narrative in particular. a lot of times when you have conversations with people about narrative in games, they want it to be predictable. If you're giving the player a meaningful choice, this is a choice they make with an expectation of what will happen. And oftentimes, if the expectation is not met, players will feel cheated. Like, I chose this because I wanted to save the peasant, and the peasant ended up dying anyway. Like, this is unfair. But I think that is a beautiful place to actually inject randomness, because I think randomness at its heart can free us from this conscious thought, can make an experience which feels more magical. And this was the primary kind of objective when we made Immortality. Let me see if this video works. God damn it. This was going to show you how Immortality works. The way Immortality works, if you haven't played it, this is a game about lost movies, and the primary mechanic in the game is you watch footage from a series of old movies, and at any point you can freeze the footage and you can click on anything on the screen, and it will then generate a match cut. It will jump you to a different scene entirely in which the same object appears. So you can do things that are kind of intentional and conscious. You can say, I want to see what else this actress does. Click on the face of an actress. But you can also be like, that flower is interesting. I'll click on the flower, jump to another scene with a flower. This kind of the ability to just engage in different levels. But whilst this is a very powerful tool for the player, you can literally click on anything, which is very empowering, very special. When you jump to a new scene, you lose some power. The game is going to decide what scene to take you to, and there is kind of an algorithmic logic behind that, but there's a lot of randomness there too. So right up until launch, we were worried, is taking a narrative game where the primary mechanic has this imprecision built in, where randomness is part of that core loop, where surprising things will happen, like, is that going to piss off players, or will it generate a kind of magic? And it worked, right? It was a successful experiment. It did communicate a kind of magic. People felt that what we wanted to do, we had this goal, which was we're making a game about cinema. And for me, I felt that the magic of cinema was in the cut, right? It was in this magical jump between series of images and that injection of something unexpected. And so we wanted to find a game mechanic that communicated that, and injecting that RNG, having that randomness at the core of the game, was our way of trying to create something surprising that would delight the audience. So this was our initial experiment in injecting randomness right in the kind of place you would not expect to see it. And then this kind of leads, that mechanic in Immortality, I talk a lot about it being an expressive mechanic. And it kind of leads to this other idea that I think is very important in gaming. I saw a TikTok video where a guy said that if you want people to think you're smart, you should put diagrams in your presentation, and especially triangles. And here we go. This is actually a triangle that I do use day to day. This is kind of my internal attempt to boil down what makes games interesting and different to other mediums. What are the core properties of a video game? And I basically have challenge, exploration, and then expression. I have Mario here because I believe this is like one of the purest examples of these elements of a game coming together and creating something very special. But expression is the one that we don't talk about as much. And I think it's actually really important. If you're making an interactive experience, if the point of this thing is that a real live human is going to sit down in front of it, I want to feel like it matters who that human is. I want that person to feel like they're expressing something of themselves. So for me, this is really key. And it's different to agency, right? We talk a lot about agency in games, the idea that I should feel powerful, that the things I'm doing matter, that I'm essentially the prime mover of the universe of the game. But I think agency in that sense takes us away from that dreamlike state. I think the idea that the player is taking action and that is primarily going to be what makes things happen in the world, to me, that takes us away from the playfulness of a dream. And when I talk about expression, really what I mean by expression is taking those actions and removing them from that immediate consequence. If I'm expressing myself, I'm often playing and doing things without an immediate goal, right? And I'm exposing something of myself. So when I look for expressive actions in games, I'm looking for kind of activities where I feel like I'm communicating something unique about myself. I feel like I have a range of choices, and often my motivation might be unconscious. I think a lot about the idea of looking, of how I express my curiosity as being something that the game should listen to. This was on my mind when I made Her Story. This is an introduction by J.G. Ballard to his book, The Atrocity Exhibition. This is a very surreal book. It's a series of small events and little scenes that don't really connect together. This big sort of kaleidoscopic collection of weird imagery. And Ballard was compelled to write this introduction after publication, explaining to people how they should go about reading or playing this book. I'll quickly read to you. Readers who find themselves daunted by the unfamiliar narrative structure of the Atrocity Exhibition, far simpler than it seems at first glance, might try a different approach. Rather than start at the beginning of each chapter, as in a conventional novel, simply turn the pages until a paragraph catches your eye. If the ideas or images seem interesting, scan the nearby paragraphs for anything that resonates in an intriguing way. Fairly soon, I hope, the fog will clear and the underlying narrative will reveal itself. In effect, you'll be reading the book in the way it was written. When I read this, when I was trying to design Her Story, it resonated so hard with me. This idea that I am navigating this experience by just following my curiosity, this unconscious just browsing, seeing something that's interesting, zooming in on it, and the idea that the novel would then form around that, and I would be jumping around, having this very personal, subjective experience. That felt like exactly the kind of game I was making. And in particular, I'll come back to this, the idea that this was similar to how the thing was written, that felt very special to me, because I think there's something about the act of writing, of designing, of creating something that has this magical energy, right? We go and dream in order to create these stories, to create these games, and there's so much freedom and creativity and magic in that moment that by the time you get to the finished piece has been hidden and put away, and it feels like the finished movie, the finished game is fixed and should always have been in this shape. And so with my games, I'm always thinking, how can I actually pull the player into that experience with me? Is there a way that we can feel like we're kind of co-creating, that magic and creativity that exists in the writing or designing is something that the player is exposed to and is participating in? So I found this very illuminating. I'm going to give you an example now from Silent Hill. So when we made Silent Hill Shattered Memories, we wanted the whole game to feel like a dream. Spoilers for a game that's now like 15 years old. It kind of is a dream, so we wanted to subtly key that in. And we had this thing that we called the self-fulfilling prophecy. So when you play a normal video game, or if you're playing a traditional survival horror game, a lot of what you do as a player is kind of wander around the environment, figuring where you can go, where you can't go, where are the important rooms, and you'll probably come across a puzzle, and then the trick is, now I need to find the objects I need for the puzzle, I need to solve the riddle, I need to figure out how these things work. There is a lot of conscious thinking about the environment, thinking about the role of everything in it. Nothing that is there is without purpose. Everything serves the puzzle or your navigation. So what we did in Shattered Memories was we had lots of these. Here, you're in a clothing store, and the player reads a note which says, "Hey, I've put the key inside your favorite jacket." And so in a normal survival horror game, that would be a clue that would enable you to figure out where the key was. What happens in Shattered Memories is, when you walk up, the first jacket that you interact with is where we will put the key. So it's a magic trick. The key is always where you look. And then we do this on the level design as well. So near the start of the game, you walk into this intersection, and there are only 2 buildings with lights on. There's this diner and this bar. And in a normal game, you would investigate both of them, figure out which was the important place, where should I go first. What happens in this game is, wherever you choose to go ends up being where the next piece of story will occur. If you walk into the diner, you meet a policewoman who then fills you in and kind of leads you into the next step of the story. If you go into the bar, you meet a barmaid who talks to you. You have a different scene. The game then continues and pushes you in a different direction. And so as you play the game and you're exposed to these again and again and again, it starts to feel like somehow the game knows what you're thinking, right? It starts to feel like these unconscious choices you're making to go into the diner, to pick the red jacket, are manifesting immediately in the cool content. Essentially, wherever you walk as a player, whatever you look at, that's where the next cool thing happens. And that is a very dreamlike experience, right? We're untethering it from this kind of conscious thought where the environment becomes a puzzle to be solved, and actually the environment is something where you just follow your curiosity and it will be rewarded. So this was a very kind of interesting thing. It was very hard to pitch to the business people and the executives because they saw us spending all this money on content that people consciously weren't even aware that they were getting, right? They didn't realize we were throwing away things. They didn't realize there was stuff they wouldn't see, but I felt that the understanding you would develop across the course of the game, the feeling of being in a dream, would be worth it. A much simpler example, Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild is a magical game in my opinion, and it's very different from a lot of open world games because Nintendo wants you to feel the joy of existing in the world, right? A lot of open world games, the rationale for the open world is, oh, this will space out objectives. You could go north, south, east, west, but it doesn't really matter. When Nintendo tell you that you can go in any direction, they mean it. And when you wander off the beaten path in Zelda, if you see something sparkling on the trees, on the mountaintop, you see there's some little lake or something down here, if you go and investigate and if you follow your curiosity, you are usually rewarded with something delightful and magical. And so there is this feeling that as a player, just being interested in something, following my curiosity, is going to be what unlocks the interesting content. And this, for me, is a very dreamlike feel. We have 2 games that we're working on that I can't really tell you much about. They are code names, Project C and Project D. The D doesn't stand for dream, but I guess it could. That would make sense. And both of these games, we're trying to take these ideas further. So in particular, we're building a lot of systems that we kind of call just-in-time systems. So the idea is, just as the player approaches somewhere, we need to rearrange the world and place content right in front of them. So again, there's this idea of, in a normal game, you would have your map, and there would be important objectives placed around the map, and you would figure out where to go next, collect things, maybe backtrack because you realize there's a specific order required of you. What we're building is a game where if the player decides something is interesting, if the player decides I should go over there, that when they get there, that's where the cool shit is going to happen. And it's a very freeing way to make a game as well. We're doing lots more with randomness and algorithms, and this kind of leads to my sort of final point, which is thinking of a game as being like a dream isn't just about the player experience. For me, as a writer and as a creator, I want to get to the dreamy place, right? This is David Lynch complaining that in modern television, he never gets the time to experiment, to play, to get dreamy. And for me, ever since I started on Her Story and sort of had the chance to change how I made games versus when I made it for the bigger companies, a real focus has been, how can I carve out space so that when I'm creating this thing, I can go to the dreamy place? How can I carve out the space where I can imagine and feel free? And a lot of making a video game is very undreamy. And sort of making traditional games, like I struggle to make a choose your own adventure narrative because I'm always thinking, if I'm writing a scene and I know that I'm having to pay off a consequence from a choice that was made 2 turns back, and I know that at some point I need to bring this story back to a central point so that everything can kind of carry on. That is, that's a cage around my mind. It stops me from getting dreamy. It stops me just following an idea where it wants to go. So I've been trying to build these games and systems that enable me to get dreamy. This is, I don't think there's any spoilers here. No, we're good. This is one of the spreadsheets on Project C, and a lot of my process is finding structures that allow me to create pieces of content without worrying about the gameplay. So for example, in Immortality, we would have spreadsheets like this, and I would go away and tell myself, I'm going to write the scene where the actors are having a party in this apartment in New York, and I just go into the dreamy place and imagine how that could play out, and I write whatever the hell I want to write. And at no point was I thinking, I need to make sure there are things to click on. I need to understand how the player might find this scene. I would finish writing the scene, and then I would go in, and usually there's a lot of numbers. So I would then attach a bunch of numbers to the scene that would describe what was happening in the scene, how dramatic it was, what themes were being explored. And then we would go in and tag every single object that was on screen, and we would kind of tell the code how objects related to each other. So code knew that an orange and an apple were both fruits, so they could link to each other. They knew that Marissa Marcel in this scene is playing a character, and in a different scene, she's playing a different character. So it would have an understanding of how to connect things. And I had the confidence in writing those scenes that I didn't need to worry about the gameplay or the larger structure, because when the player came to it, the player would make connections. The sort of algorithmic logic at the heart of the game would know when was a good time to jump into this scene I'd just written. What were the connections between other scenes? I used a similar technique in Her Story, where I would just write scenes, and I didn't worry about how the words connected. There was no master plan for the puzzle of Her Story, where you were trying to figure out words and uncover scenes. It was all sort of balance checked algorithmically, but at the point of writing, I was very far from worrying about the mechanics of the gameplay. So we're doing something very similar. We're making Project D is a 3D third-person game, looks like a normal game, and we're trying to extend this idea into that. So I'm creating content, I'm designing scenes, locations, characters that I am creating purely for the fun of it, and I'm not worried about the consequences and the connections. I'm allowing myself to get dreamy, and then we have game mechanics and game systems that will present that content to the player, will allow them to express themselves, and allow the game to then serve up things which feel timely and delightful for them. So continuing to figure out, what does it mean to make a game more like a dream, and what does it mean to allow me to dream more when I'm creating the game? So in conclusion, I'm not criticizing other people's games, but I believe games that are ruled by rationality are not necessarily a healthy escape. I think if I'm playing games dominated by conscious thought in which I am repeating the structure of capitalism, or if I'm playing a game which is, I'm living out something that's more like work, there are these things that feel very satisfying, but I don't think are necessarily healthy. We are currently trapped in an iron prison that is our society. And I believe that, and this is getting very pretentious, that if we create games that allow people to dream, that use the language of dreams, that use the structure of dreams. By playing them, people will unlock access to that part of themselves that is a very healthy, useful part of themselves, the irrational part that is very human. And I think this will enable us to make the world a better place. So I encourage you to pursue these ideas. And that is the end of me talking, and now I will listen to you. I did a good job. I allowed for time for questions. This is the fun part.
Who wants to be first?
Hello? Yeah.
Hello.
So, hello, Sam. Love your games. Talking to you feels kind of dreamlike. So, I'm extremely amazed by Immortality and how you actually managed to make it a reality. I'm a producer, mainly. So, I was wondering, was like any part of the process where you did like, I don't know, like kind of a prototype that you, I don't know, gathered with some friends, recorded something and then put people to explore, because before like hiring a bunch of actors and like writing the script of 3 movies, I don't know, like how did you validate like the match cut mechanic? Because on my mind that would never work, but it works so well, and I don't know, I have no clue.
I mean, a lot of it comes from a misplaced arrogance, right, of having the confidence to just try the thing. But all of the FMV games and the games you're making now, there is upfront a lot of emphasis on a prototype. But the prototype will usually be extremely ugly and extremely crude, and the pleasure of making Her Story was not making it for a publisher. So all the games I've made before that, there was a publisher, and a lot of times you will be making a game and you'll have to show it to the publisher. And they are usually, most people are bad at seeing an unfinished game and imagining what it will become. So when I started on Her Story, I was like, it's only me involved. I'm gonna make a prototype that answers the questions I need answered, but is not getting distracted with visuals and things. So actually, the prototype on Immortality was purely text. We had a program that would suck in all the scripts, and then you could essentially play pretty much Immortality as it shipped, but every time you clicked on a video, it would just it would print up the dialogue and some of the scene description, and it would sort of time it out as if you were seeing it. And whenever a character was mentioned or an object was mentioned in the script, it would print up a colored box. So it was like, oh, Marissa is here. Oh, Marissa has picked up a dagger. And it would then generate the match cut links between those. So I could play it, and I could squint and feel like, does this feel like it's going to be a fun experience? Does the algorithm we've created for the match cut drop me into interesting places in scenes? Does it feel confusing forever, or is there a point where it starts to feel less confusing? So we tested that, and the thing that's scary or different is no one else played that prototype. I did not focus test it. We didn't get user feedback. And part of that is I trust in the algorithms that we make. So for example, Her Story, before I launched Her Story, nobody else had played it. So I couldn't tell you for sure it was going to work, but I had a lot of kind of algorithms that analyzed the structure of that game and sort of said, there are meaningful connections between these clips. It would look and say, this particular clip is hard to find because of the words used in it. And then I would go in and I would tweak some of the words. So I knew that the numbers showed me that this game was balanced. And I knew that the experience of playing the prototype felt magical to me, and that was what I was trying to capture. So in all those games, there is this heavy focus on a prototype that satisfies me that it's going to work. And then we know that we always have like the algorithm to rely on. So we knew that with Immortality, as written, there were things to click on that we could 100% anticipate. We knew there was going to be a dagger in this scene that would connect it to a bunch of other daggers. But we also knew that when we went and filmed it, the art people would put different shit in the scene, and they would add things that we hadn't anticipated, and they would create connections that were not planned by us. And that as long as the algorithm knew how to meaningfully connect these things, that would just make the game richer and richer. And then there is usually then a period of testing once the final footage is in, where there's very little that we can do, right, once that's in, but there are tweaks we can make. So in the case of Immortality, we did a focus test, and the only question we were asking, because again, working with publishers, sometimes you will do user tests, and it's very easy to be distracted by a reaction one player might have. I think as well, when people are playing something in a test, they play it slightly differently, right? When I'm at home, sat on the sofa, I might wait a bit more time before I get frustrated. I might be willing to kind of figure things out. But in the case of Immortality, the only thing we tested was how long, this is a spoiler, there's some spooky stuff in Immortality, and the only thing we tested was how long does it take a player to find the spooky thing? Because we knew we wanted it to be sort of around 90 minutes. It didn't want to be in the first 5 seconds. It didn't want to take them 3 hours. And we were explicitly not telling them about the spooky stuff. I've ruined that now, but we wanted it to be something you discovered. We actually had a big argument. It wasn't a big argument. We had a disagreement with a specific platform because they said the really cool thing in this game is the spooky stuff. That should be in the tutorial in the first 5 minutes, right? You need to explain to people how to find this cool shit. Currently, you're not telling them. How are they supposed to figure it out? But we had this confidence that if we just left them to their own devices, they would discover it organically, and that would feel so much better. So we did a test, and that showed us that it was taking slightly too long. And we had, like, in the algorithm, it was aware of how long has it been since you've seen something spooky, and it would lead you towards things that were had potential to be spooky if it felt like now is a good time. We had we used to call them heartbeats. They were like sine waves running in the background where it would be like, oh, now is a time for something spooky, because we didn't want to always be pushing you, right? And then it just feel like the game was forcing you into a corner. So the game would sort of have these sort of sine waves deciding what kinds of things it should be showing you. So that was the only thing we tested, and we tweaked that algorithm to push you slightly more towards spooky things. But yeah, it's very much, I think the most useful skill a game director can have is the ability to squint, is to play something that's not finished and understand and see the vision for it, right? And there are lots of people in the games industry that aren't very good at squinting. I've been told horror stories about game directors who are like, I don't know if this is good until you show me the final art, right? And then they'll build all the final art, and then it doesn't work, and then you throw it away, and it's very wasteful. But for me, knowing how to define a prototype that will answer the question I have, but I'm sticking to the vision, and I have to have confidence in that vision that this thing is going to be fun and work.
Thank you very much. Amazing response.
Hello.
Hi.
I'm a huge Silent Hill fan, so my question is about that topic. So there's this game that was to be shared memories, which was called Heart. I'd like to know what happened there. What happened so that it made you shift from Cold Heart to shared memories in the end? I also would like to ask if you'd like to return to that project eventually, or take some ideas from it and work on them in a different project sometime in the future. Thank you.
Okay, so the first question is a very fun one. How much tea shall I spill? So we made Silent Hill Origins, and I think you can go online and read about that project. That was a project that another team started, was a disaster, and we were given 6 months to fix it. And we basically remade the game from scratch very quickly to make, I think Silent Hill Origins is an okay game. And it's probably the work I'm proudest of, because I know how hard that team worked to take it from where it was to get it to that level. But after that, Konami were impressed that we'd managed to fix that project, and so we were having discussions around creating a new Silent Hill game. And this was the first chance I had had to come up with an original idea. I'd worked on lots of games before that were other people's IP. I was doing sequels or spin-offs, and this was a chance to actually say, here are my ideas, right? And I wanted to make a horror game that did these clever things that I showed you that play with the psychology of the player. I wanted to do interesting things with the narrative framing, do all these interesting, playful things. And so we pitched a game which ultimately ended up being called Cold Heart. And it was about a young woman who is in therapy to deal with something traumatic that had happened in her past. And as you played the game, the idea was that the game would mold itself around the player and unconsciously, secretly be analyzing the player. And we had all these other ideas about making a horror game where the action element was not combat, right? I could talk for hours about the weirdness of survival horror being half Lovecraft, right? It's Alone in the Dark, Lovecraft, Mansion, Diaries, and then George A. Romero Zombies, survivalism, right? And that became the template. And it was weird to me that in Silent Hill, in a game that is inspired by things like Jacob's Ladder and Francis Bacon's art, a game which is psychological, still had to have shotguns and medikits, right? The kind of survivalism stuff. So we had that pitch, and so this is the tea. We had a producer who was a little bit of a cowboy, was a little bit of a maverick, and we knew that we could make things happen by sort of convincing him or making him feel like ideas made sense. And we got to this point where we'd pitched this game, and there was a lot of other stuff going on as well about signing this project. And it turned out that Konami in Japan, and this is the story I was told, this may be complete lies, had approved the idea of remaking Silent Hill 1, and this had been green-lit in their system. But then when they'd looked into it, they realized it was going to be too expensive. And so they instead made Silent Hill Origins. They made a kind of prequel. And this producer was like, hey, do you know what? If we tell the bosses that this is a remake of Silent Hill 1, we can start making it tomorrow because the funding has been approved. So that's what we're going to do. So it's like, okay, this game is now officially a remake of Silent Hill 1. And at that point, there was a question of like, how truthful do we have to be about that? And I was worried because there had been the Silent Hill movie, which was essentially a remake of Silent Hill 1, and they had attempted to sort of fix, tweak the dialogue, make things a bit more believable. We had just made Silent Hill Origins, which was essentially a rehash of the first game. Same characters, same situations, same locations. So I felt there was nothing creatively left to do. If we made a remake of Silent Hill 1 that was true to the game, there wouldn't be much interesting ground to cover. And I really wanted to explore these ideas I had around the psychology, around changing how a horror game works. So my pitch was, let's tell everybody this is a remake of Silent Hill 1, but it isn't really. And actually, I was really excited about the idea the story about that girl in Cold Heart was the story of her inventing a false reality for herself. It was about her denying her memories. And so this idea of saying, this is a remake of this game that you've played and loved, but as you play it, you're like, wait a minute, this isn't how I remember it. This is different. Actually would enable me to tell that story in a whole extra way. So I get spoilers for an old game, but it's ultimately revealed in Shattered Memories that the protagonist is not Harry Mason, it's his daughter Cheryl. And really, the daughter Cheryl is living out the story of the girl in Cold Heart. And it enabled us to actually have this extra layer of reveal on top, this extra level of kind of screwing with people's heads. So that's kind of how we ended up making that. And I remember there were awkward, we had like a vertical slice presentation where we were told, look, when the executives play this game, we don't want them to realize it isn't Silent Hill 1. So you've got to only show things that will feel like this is remaking that original game. As to returning to that, well, Project D, I think I've said this elsewhere, is in some ways a spiritual successor to Shattered Memories. And we are definitely taking some of the elements that I talked about here, about the way in which it feels like a dream, some of the stuff we did in the way in which the narrative and the locations were assembled based on how you played and expressed yourself, taking a lot of that to heart with a 2025 perspective, a lot of the lessons that I've learned from Immortality, the way that randomness worked there, the structure of these FMV games, we're kind of mushing it all together. So we're hoping it will be a game that will delight fans of Shattered Memories. I'm very intrigued to see what else people are doing with Silent Hill right now. Big fans of No Code, so the game that they're making with Konami and Annapurna. I'm very intrigued. I always felt that as a franchise, I was interested in telling different stories within Silent Hill, right? Of using that as a permission to go into interesting and weird places. So seeing that Konami is sort of actually branching out and trying things is interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Sam. Oh, it's working? Yeah. Hi, Sam.
Hi.
A huge fan of your games. They really satisfy curiosity in a really different way, so they're great. I was curious when you were talking about how to nudge the player towards the spooky part in Immortality. You were making use of this algorithm to use that. And there's this concept of the golden path, usually in games with multiple choice. And in games like Her Story, when you didn't have the algorithm to help with that, I'm curious about the process of how do you design this canonical path. Was there a canonical path that the player should take? Was there a golden path? And if so, how do you nudge the players towards it?
No, so the moment when I was making Her Story and it felt exciting was the bit where I realized I wanted to abandon everything I'd been taught about game design, right? All of the tools that I had in terms of scripting, there's so many tools as a game designer to trick people to follow the golden path, right? Valve with like the Half-Life games have shown a lot of these things where you're like, the player thinks they're choosing to go through this door, but it's because there's a light flashing or whatever. And there was a point, I knew that I wanted to make a detective game, and I knew that the thing that frustrated me about detective games was feeling limited, right? I love Phoenix Wright, but there's always a point when you're playing that game where you're too far ahead of the game or you're not understanding and you're just like frustrated that the game wants you to do one specific thing to unlock the next stage of the mystery. So I knew I wanted to find a way to make a more organic detective game, and I kind of had these ideas, and I remember I loaded up some flowchart software, and I was like, okay, if this is going to be a game where I uncover things through words, I need to figure that out. I need to figure out what words will lead me to where. And I started trying to put this thing on a flowchart, and I just felt like, this feels crap. This doesn't feel the kind of organic experience I wanted. And I went away and I found some real-life transcripts of real police interviews. And I pulled the text out of them, and I stuck it in a small prototype where I kind of played them like you would play Her Story. And I discovered that even though these transcripts had not been designed by a game designer, just the way that language works, the fact that these people were trying to lie to the police, but the police were asking them questions where they would reveal themselves, it already created like an interesting flow. And I was like, holy shit, this feels really fun and exciting and free, and I've never felt like this in a game before. So then I was like, okay, this feels risky to throw away everything I know about making games, but embrace that free-form nature. So then, deciding to do that, I went away and I wrote all the content for Her Story, just, like I said, in this dreamy place. I knew I had 7 days to fill, and I knew what had happened. I knew the backstory, but I just let the characters talk and live out these scenes. And then after that, although there isn't an algorithm in the game, I had the algorithm offline that was looking at the words that were being used in scenes, seeing how frequently that word occurred, how did it connect to other scenes, and then I would tweak things, right? So it would tell me, you can't find this clip because it uses, the only unique word in it is wedding, but there's a whole bunch of other clips over here that use the word wedding. So you have to lose wedding from somewhere else. And then it got really exciting for me as a writer, because then I would look at these scenes that were talking about weddings, right? And this is like very thematic to the story, the concept of marriage and what it means. And I got to be kind of poetic about it. I'd be like, well, there are 7 scenes that currently use the word wedding. Which 5 of these do I think are the most interesting set? And then I would change it. So instead of saying wedding here, we say marriage. This goes out the way, pull this one in. So I just kept running the algorithm, and it would tell me, oh, this scene is hard to find, this word is used too much. And I would just keep sculpting it. And it felt like being a sculptor, where I was just looking at it from a different angle, going in, trimming something. So that was still a case where, for the key creation, I was in this dreamy place where I just let the characters talk and things happen. And then there was the algorithm which helps me sculpt it and gives me the confidence that when people play it, they can do whatever the hell they want, and it will still become a real story. I also think there is an affordance of players will create a story, right? As humans, we make patterns, we see patterns, and we create order where it doesn't even exist. And so there was a thing where giving people freedom to just jump around in this story, they will naturally create a shape to it. And they have control over the lever, right? Like the gas pedal. So if you're playing Her Story and it's been a while since you found something really juicy, you're like, oh, I want to inject a bit of drama, you'll kind of have a list of, oh, these are the topics I want to go back to. Oh, I know that she has a husband called Simon. I've put that to one side, but if I want to get back into something juicy, I'm going to type Simon, right? But then similarly, you might have uncovered a lot of really big things and have this cool story in your head, and you're like, I've got time to chill now, right? I'm going to noodle around the edges of this story. And so there's a self-pacing that comes from giving the player that much freedom. It's very much like, I think about Zelda a lot, right? I'm playing Breath of the Wild. I know that I need to go to the village to continue the main quest. But right now, I just want to wander around this forest and kind of shake trees and do fun things. But if I start getting bored of that, I'm like, okay, if I want things to kick up again, I will head to the village. And I know that's where the story will begin. So I think having that sort of freedom, having that random access, gives people the power to create the shape of a story themselves. So there was no golden path. There was no good way of playing it. I got time. I'll get a bit nerdy about detective stories. So when I was making Her Story, I got really, really nerdy about detective stories and the history of detective stories. And there is an evolution in the detective story. So you start with Agatha Christie, and that's the whodunit, right? It is a puzzle, and you will watch Poirot turn up, there is a dead body, there is a mystery, and Poirot will investigate and spend the whole novel coming up with clues and ideas, and at the very end of the novel, they reveal the solution to the puzzle. And usually you can't guess, right? The idea is that you want to solve the puzzle, but it's usually too complicated or too clever. And this becomes a huge success. The detective story in that form is very successful. But at some point, you'd seen every twist. In fact, it's crazy. If you just go through Agatha Christie's list of books, every twist, she's come up with every twist. She found them all, right? And ever since then, we've just been reusing them. So the second phase of the detective story is the howdunit. And this is like Columbo. The TV show Columbo is a howdunit. At the start of an episode of Columbo, they show you who the murderer is. That puzzle's gone. They show you the murderer, and then Columbo shows up. And now this is a more sophisticated story because you know something Columbo doesn't know. And there's a lot of emotional investment and dramatic irony because you're going, will the murderer give themselves away? And there is still a puzzle. The puzzle is, how did they cover their tracks? How did they hide the evidence? How will Columbo figure this out, right? So it's still got the puzzle, but there is this extra level of emotional kind of complexity that comes with me knowing more than the characters in the story. You get lots of Columbos, lots of things like this. And then the third step of the evolution is the why-done-it. And the why-done-it, you see a lot of Scandinavian cop shows. The why-done-it is like, do you know what? The puzzle isn't the point here. The point is we're going to have a portrait of a really fucked up mind. We're going to go deep into the psychology of why did this person kill. A lot of serial killer movies are like this. It's like, let's get real deep into the mentality of a serial killer. A show like True Detective is a why-done-it, but the twist there is it's the detectives who are actually the source of inquiry. We're interested in the psychology of these two fucked up detectives. And, it makes itself very clear they don't really care about the puzzle and the mystery. In fact, the weakness for me of season 1 of True Detective is at the very end, they're like, oh shit, I guess we have to tell you the solution to the mystery. And it's very arbitrary and it's very silly because they don't really care. And when I made her story, I was really interested in how hard it was to write a detective story because the audience is so smart. They've seen all the Agatha Christie twists. They've watched all the Columbo and Diagnosis Murder. They've played detective games. They've watched movies. So they've seen all the twists. And it's really hard to find that fresh angle on things. And what I realized with her story was I can use that to my advantage. If I take away a lot of the pieces, if I give them more work to do, that knowledge that the audience has will actually become the superpower because now we're using that to figure the story out. And the beautiful thing with her story was, depending on how you play it, it can be a whodunit. It can be a howdunit. It can be a whydunit. It is all of these different types of story at once, depending on how you play it. So that was something that I kind of was really excited about, not having a golden path, not having that structure.
Yeah, thank you. As a huge detective story nerd, too, I'd say her story is the best detective game I ever played. It really made me feel like a detective. And as you said, you could focus on the why done it at some points or just explore other things. So that was great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Obviously, we are on time now, but we have one more question. Very quick.
Let's do one more.
I saw that hand first. Very quick, Sam. Very quick.
Okay. I can't do quick. I talk too much.
I wrote it down. So when you say get dreamy, I'm very curious about what the themes you feel personally connected to that took you to that place. Meaning, what are some central themes that you always go back to that makes dreamy like a good tool for you? I don't know if that was clear or.
Okay. Yeah, I think the interesting thing about making art and putting it out into the world and then reading what people think of it and then talking with people about it later is, especially if you're expressing something about yourself, at some point you start to analyze yourself, right? And you start to be aware of themes that are recurring, and it becomes a useful therapeutic tool. but for me, I really do want to go to a place where I'm not over, I think if you're aware of the theme that you're trying to communicate too early on, it becomes boring and it becomes didactic. So I'll often want to discover that theme. I realized that I, for some reason, am very interested in questions of identity and of this idea of our consciousness. So I will always find myself turning to stories that are about the identity that we project versus the identity inside ourselves. How we, like when I made Telling Lies, I was obsessed with the idea that you can never truly know another person, right? And specifically the idea of an intimate partner. You can never really know what's going on inside their head. And there's this effort as a human, the reason we go to art is to try and see what is happening in other people's heads. I'm really into that. I realized when I was making her story that early on I realized it was actually about my two grandmothers. I'd lost both my grandmothers fairly recently when I was making that, and I felt this real shame that I had not spent time talking to them and learning about their lives. I had this grandmother who, when she was younger, had been a singer on the stage, and during the war she had to stop. And I remember there was a photo of her on her mantelpiece looking very glamorous on stage, and as a kid being like, "Who's that, Grandma?" And she was like, "That's me." And I was like, "Oh, but you're this kind of cuddly old lady that," she was a cook in a school. So I was like, "You're this," she was the matriarch of our Northern English family. So I thought of her in all these terms of being the matriarch, of being a mother, being a grandmother, of helping school children, cooking them meals. And I was like, damn it, I would love to have just one day sat down. And because we're British and we don't talk about things to each other, I'd never had that moment of sitting down and going, tell me what it was like before you met grandfather. When you were young and single, like tell me about the life of being on the stage in London. And I was so frustrated that I'd never asked these questions. And I kind of realized as I was making her story, oh, this is a chance for me to sit down and ask questions of my grandmother. And I realized that the character was living out lots of ideas of what it meant in the kind of mid-20th century to be a woman and the expectations of what it means to be a woman and a mother and a wife versus the inner life that she had, right? And this was like the singer that she had been versus the woman that the symbol that I saw. And I realized, quite late that that's what her story was about. So I like to kind of, come across what these themes are. It was only like when we were filming Immortality that I kind of realized what the themes of Immortality were. In discussion with the actress, we were talking about it, and she was asking, I know this isn't a short answer, she was asking, like, is there a point when my character was happy? So in Immortality, there are lots of different eras she lives through. Is she ever truly happy? Does she finish in a happy place? And I had explained to the composer, we wrote these themes for the music, and I was like, the themes are, how do human beings deal with mortality? And we had answers, and so one of the answers was religion. It was like, the idea that there is an afterlife, and that we can access it through ritual, through prayer, that there was this abstract idea of something after. Is it one way of us dealing with this as humans? And one other way was the idea of creating something that will live beyond us. So creating art, having a child, making a building, something that will actually live on beyond you was one solution. And then our middle solution, which was represented in the game by the 1970s in New York, was actually living in the moment. It was, one way of dealing with our inevitable death is to actually just be present in the moment, and through dance, sex, food, actually just enjoy and relish the joy of being a human. And that was just one of the answers. And it was only sort of in discussing with the actress, was she ever truly happy? And I was like, actually, I think this moment in time where you had this time in New York where there was like a meaningful arrival of queer culture where people could be who they wanted to be, whereas artists, they were living a life that was kind of artistic, and it felt like this real moment. And that was when we were like, oh, okay, I think that is actually the message that we're trying to give people with this game is that a lot of these ways of trying to seek immortality are less useful, and this idea of connecting joyfully. There's a scene in Immortality where the young actress is repeating something that the director of photography has said. Someone asks her if doing nude scenes is like upsetting or shocking to her, and she says that there's something beautiful about it, and she explains that if someone is seeing footage of her on screen, there is a physical connection between these people. This idea that when they're filming, light bounces off her skin, goes into the camera, interacts chemically with the film. That film is then taken to a lab, processed, a print is made, that is taken to a movie theater, light is injected into that film, it bounces off the screen into the eye of another human being, and there is always this real physical connection between, across time and space, these different humans, and she gets all excited about that. And I was like, I'm actually, like, this is me speaking to the audience. Like, there's something inherently joyful about creating art as a means to connect to people in the moment. And as well, we're thinking lots about video games, and it's very weird making video games because they date so quickly, right? Like, Silent Hill Shattered Memories, it's kind of hard to play now. You need to go and find a Wii. They're very expensive, the secondhand copies. I don't have one, it's too expensive. And as well, to play it now, you're like, well, the graphics look a bit crappy, like you can't quite connect to it. And I had a friend who is a novelist, and we would talk about this. I'd be like, you're so lucky because you create a novel and it can live forever, right? It doesn't have an expiration date. It's this perfect form of expression. And we talked about it because we were working on a game that got canceled, and we knew we were making creative compromises on this game, but we felt like the payoff was the size of the audience we could reach. So we were talking a lot about, like, what is even the point of making art? And I think what we ended up owning and what Immortality is about is it's enough for me to make a game now that you all play this year that touches you in some way, changes your life, is taken on board, becomes part of you, and doesn't matter that in 5 years people can't play this game. Like, there's something about that moment of connection that I think is very human and special. There we go. That was a short answer to that question. Thank you.
¡Ey! Ahora hay como, bueno, no media hora, porque Sam Barlow se ha comido 15 minutos de esa media hora, pero el concierto de Vivic y compañía, que va a pasar lista, así que no vayáis.